The bell tower at St. Vessel Cemetery had not rung in 41 years, yet at exactly 11:47 on the morning of the funeral, it rang once, a single low note that traveled through the fog like something remembering itself. Beneath that sound stood 183 mourners, every one of them silent, every one of them soaked to the collarbone, and not a single one of them willing to raise their eyes to the man beside the open grave. He wore a charcoal coat that had not been buttoned. His right glove was missing. His breath did not fog the air the way theirs did. The most feared name in the Eastern Harbor stood 2 meters from a coffin, polished so dark it reflected the low gray sky, and the 97th richest man in the country stood behind him, weeping quietly into a silk handkerchief, terrified less of the dead woman than of the living one who had just walked out of the crowd. A girl, 7 years old, maybe 8. Brown-skinned, small, entirely alone. Her yellow raincoat was 2 sizes too large, and the hem dragged through the wet grass as she moved past bodyguards who did not see her, past captains who did not turn, past a priest whose hand froze halfway through a blessing. She walked as though the aisle had been carved for her. And if you have ever wondered whether one small act of tenderness can undo a lifetime of fear, stay with me until the last word of this story, because what this girl did in the next 30 seconds unraveled an empire that 3 decades of law enforcement could not touch. Tap the like button, tell me in the comments what city you're listening from, then walk with me into the fog. The city was called Halden Bay, a port town on the northern coast that liked to pretend it was a city and mostly succeeded. It had 2 rivers, 1 cathedral, 6 shipping cartels, and a rain season that lasted from October to the following October. That morning, the rain smelled of iron and diesel. It always did near the docks. The cemetery sat on a bluff above the harbor, and from the high paths you could see the container cranes moving even now, even during a burial that had shut down half the government. Nobody in Halden Bay ever really stopped working. They only stopped being seen. Silas Merrick was 46 years old and had not slept in 4 nights. He stood at the edge of the grave the way certain men stand at the edge of high cliffs, not curious about falling, only about how long it would take. His wife of 11 years, Odette, was inside the coffin below him. She had gone off the coastal road in a black sedan at 4:12 in the morning 3 days earlier, and the guardrail had bent in a way that made the investigators quiet. Silas had already read the report twice. The brake lines had been perfect. That was the problem. Nothing was perfect at 4:12 in the morning on the coastal road except an intention. He had not cried. That fact had traveled ahead of him through the cemetery like a rumor. He did not cry when the priest spoke, did not cry when Odette's sister collapsed, did not cry when the coffin was lowered enough for the first handful of dirt. He simply stood there, and his stillness made everyone else's grief feel dishonest. 3 symbols framed him that morning, though only one of them knew they were symbols. On the lapel of his coat was a small pin shaped like a seabird, a gift from Odette on their first anniversary, meant, she had said, because seabirds only look free. In his left pocket was a folded handkerchief with the initials SM, embroidered in dark green thread, unused, still crisp, and around his neck, tucked beneath the collar, hung a thin silver chain with no pendant on it. The pendant had been lost years ago, and he had never replaced it, and no one alive knew why he kept the empty chain. These 3 objects would be with him in every important room for the next 41 days. The rain thickened. Someone coughed. Somewhere behind the 5th row of mourners, a phone vibrated and was smothered against a coat. And then the crowd parted, not deliberately, but the way a river parts around a stone that has always been there. The girl in the yellow raincoat stepped through. She had no umbrella. Her sneakers were the color of wet paper. She carried nothing in her hands except her hands, which she kept balled into small fists at her sides, as though she had rehearsed the walk many times but had not rehearsed the arriving. The captain of Silas's personal detail, a compact man named Renner, took 1 step forward and stopped. Later, in a room with the door locked, Renner would say he could not explain why he stopped. He would say his knees simply refused. The girl walked past him. She did not look at the coffin. She did not look at the priest or the flowers or the 200 faces that had turned into 200 stones. She looked only at Silas Merrick, and when she reached him, she did the thing that had not been done to him without his invitation for 19 years. She took his hand, Her fingers were cold, his were colder. She held him the way small children hold the hands of adults they have been told to trust, palm to palm, thumb tucked under. Then she tilted her face up into the rain and said in a voice too soft for the microphone above the grave to catch, "Don't cry, Papa." He was not crying. That was the second thing that stopped time. The first was the word. Silas Merrick had no children. Everyone in Halden Bay knew this. His wife had wanted them. He had refused, and the reason had been buried so deep in him that even Odette had stopped asking. Yet the girl said the word again, quieter, as if repeating it for her own courage. "Papa." Then she reached into the deep pocket of the yellow raincoat and pulled out a photograph in a clear plastic sleeve, folded once down the middle, and held it up to him. He took it. His hand did not shake, but the empty silver chain at his throat did. The photograph was 10 years old. He knew because he could date it by the shirt he was wearing in it, a linen one Odette had made him throw out the summer after their wedding. In the photograph, he was laughing. Actually laughing head tipped back, and beside him stood a woman with close-cropped hair, dark skin, a slight gap between her front teeth, and eyes that did not fear him. Her name had been Ife Adeyemi. She had been a field surgeon with a coastal relief hospital in the Delta country 3,000 kilometers south. He had met her during a shipping negotiation that had turned, briefly and entirely, into something else. He had spent 41 days with her. Then she had disappeared during what was reported to him as an insurgent raid on a clinic, and the report had contained a photograph of a burned building and a list of the missing, and her name had been on that list, and he had believed it because grief is easier than searching. 6 months after that, he had married Odette. He had told himself it was a strategic alliance. It had become, somewhere along the way, a real one. The girl waited. Rain ran off the brim of her hood. "What is your name?" he said. His voice was so quiet the priest a meter away did not hear it. "Zaida," the girl said. "Mama called me Zaida." He did not ask where her mother was. He did not have to. The photograph was already answering. "Come with me," he said. He turned. He was still holding her hand. He walked past the coffin without looking down at it, a discourtesy that half the room would later remember as the moment they understood the empire had a crack in it. And he walked past Renner, past his captains, past the 97th richest man in the country. And he did not stop until he reached the black car at the top of the cemetery road. Nobody moved to follow. Nobody dared. He opened the rear door himself and lifted the child into the seat and buckled her in the way a man who has never buckled a child does. Carefully, incorrectly, with his tongue between his teeth. Then he closed the door and stood in the rain for a long moment with his forehead against the cold window, and only then did his shoulders move. Once, the way a wall moves in an earthquake before it decides whether to fall. That night, in a house with white walls and no photographs, Silas Merrick sat across from a girl who ate a bowl of plain rice with butter, as though she had eaten it every day of her life. She told him this. She told him about the place she had lived, a house at the edge of a town called Varick where 7 other children lived, and the woman in charge was kind but tired. She told him her mother had gotten sick in the winter and had not gotten better. She told him her mother had given her the photograph and made her memorize a name and an address and had said, "When I am gone, you will find him, and you will tell him you are his, and you will not be afraid." She said this last part like a girl reciting a prayer. "When did she die?" he asked. 6 months ago." He looked down at his hands. His hands were the hands of a man who had signed 142 orders that had ended lives. They were also, apparently, the hands of a father. He did not know yet what to do with that arithmetic. He asked her one more question. "Who brought you here?" "A man," she said. "A man with a silver ring." He did not react. He had trained his face for 20 years not to react, but under the table, his thumb pressed against the empty silver chain at his throat, and he understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the rain, that his wife's death and this child's arrival were not 2 events. They were one. He put Zeta to bed in the room that had been meant, 11 years ago and never again, for the child Odette had wanted. He sat on the edge of the mattress until her breathing slowed. Then he went downstairs and made 3 phone calls, and by dawn, a woman named Helena Voss was on a plane from the southern capital. Helena had been his lawyer for 15 years and his friend for one. She was 52, wore men's suits, cut her own hair, and had once talked a federal prosecutor out of a case with nothing but a printed calendar and a sentence she never repeated. She arrived at his kitchen at 7:04 in the morning, took one look at the girl sleeping upstairs on the closed-circuit monitor, and said, "Silas, this is either the best thing that has ever happened to you or the trap that finishes you." "Both," he said. "Yes," she said, "probably both." She set a folder on the counter. Inside was a preliminary genetic report she had ordered from a private lab in the mountains before her plane had even landed. He had sent her the swab 3 hours earlier. The number at the bottom of the page was 99.982. He looked at it for a long time. "There's more," Helena said. "I ran her mother's name through the deep files. The death certificate is real. Signed by a hospice in Varick 6 months ago, but I also ran the certifying doctor. He signed 41 other certificates in the same month, every one of them for a woman between 30 and 50. Every one of them cremated within 24 hours. Every one of them with no next of kin except a child sent to the same home." Silas set the report down. "Someone is laundering women," Helena said, "and their children. Through my city. Through your city." He walked to the window. The harbor was awake. The cranes were moving. He said, without turning, "Ife is not dead." Helena did not answer because she did not know yet, and because she had learned in 15 years never to contradict him when his voice went that quiet. The investigation began that morning, and it was not the investigation of a grieving man. It was the investigation of a man who had, for the first time in a decade, a reason not to burn the world down. He put 4 teams on 4 continents. He put Renner on the hospice in Varick. He put Helena on the certifying doctor. And he put himself, personally, on the man with the silver ring. He did not have to look far. There was only one silver ring in his circle. It belonged to Counselor Ambrose Teller, 71 years old, a man who had stood beside Silas's father at the founding of the shipping consortium in the year Silas was born, who had held Silas on his knee during the first Christmas after Silas's mother died, who had wept openly at Silas's wedding, and who had been the second person, after Odette, that Silas had trusted with the location of the coastal roadhouse. Ambrose Teller had been the one to recommend the sedan Odette drove that night. Ambrose Teller had been the one to suggest, 10 years ago, that the missing persons list from the Delta country was reliable and the search should be closed. Ambrose Teller had, 3 days after the funeral, sent Silas a handwritten note that read, "Whatever you need, whatever the hour, your family is my family." Silas read the note 4 times, then he folded it and put it in the same drawer as the empty silver chain. The seeds of the betrayal had been there all along, if he cared to look. There was the way Ambrose had objected, gently, to Silas's marriage to Odette. She is a good woman, but is she the right woman for the family? There was the sudden retirement 8 years ago of the investigator who had first brought Silas evidence that the Delta report might have been falsified. The investigator had received a very generous pension arranged personally by Ambrose, and there was the seabird pin. Odette had told Silas once, laughing, that she had not chosen the design. Ambrose had recommended it. She had said Ambrose had told her that seabirds mate for life, which was a lie a man tells when he wants a woman to feel bound. Silas had not thought of that conversation in a decade. He thought of it now. He did not act, not yet. He watched. Meanwhile, in a room upstairs, Zaida drew. She had asked for paper on the second morning, and Silas had brought her a stack of accountants' ledgers because it was what he had in the house. She had turned them sideways and used the columns as guides. She drew houses with too many windows. She drew birds that were half fish. She drew, on the 4th day, a man in a long coat holding a smaller figure's hand, and the smaller figure was yellow. She left the drawing on the kitchen counter and did not mention it. Silas found it at 2:11 in the morning and stood over it in the dark for a long time before he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, next to the seabird pin he had removed the night before and had not been able to throw away. He did not know how to be with her. This is the truth the story cannot skip. He did not know how to talk to a child who had been raised on plain rice and prayer. So he watched her. He watched her stack her sneakers in a straight line by the door. He watched her fold her napkin into a triangle before every meal. He watched her, on the sixth morning, walk into the kitchen and, without being asked, pour him a glass of water and place it beside his hand. That gesture, small, unremarkable, entirely unrehearsed, broke something in him that Odette's coffin had not. He began to make her tea in the afternoons. He did not know she liked tea. He simply made 2 cups because he was making one for himself, and she took hers. She held the cup with both hands. She blew on it before every sip. She did not thank him because she had not been taught to thank people for things they should do anyway, and he understood that. He began to leave a folded blanket on the chair by the window every morning because she had once sat there and shivered. She did not mention the blanket. She just used it. Renner brought news on the 7th day. The hospice in Varick had burned to the ground the night before. No casualties. The certifying doctor had left the country on a private flight, registered to a shell company that traced, through 6 layers, to a firm Ambrose Teller had incorporated in a warm water republic in the year of Silas's mother's death. Helena brought worse news on the 8th day. She had found in the deep records of the Delta country the original manifest of the raid that had reportedly killed Ife Adeyemi. The manifest had 2 versions. One listed her as deceased. The other listed her as transferred to a coastal facility for injured medical personnel. The transfer had been signed in a hand Silas had known for 40 years by Ambrose Teller. Silas read the signature. He did not move for a very long time. Then he did something Helena had never seen him do. He walked upstairs, sat down beside the girl who was drawing a bird that was half fish, and asked her, "Do you remember anything else about the man with the silver ring?" She thought about it. She was 7. She frowned the way 7-year-olds frown when they are trying to be useful. "He smelled like the church," she said finally. "The church?" "The one in Varick. It smelled like the candles they light for the dead." Frankincense. Ambrose Teller wore an aftershave that his family had made for 4 generations from resin traded out of the Delta country. Silas had smelled it his whole life. It was the smell of his childhood. "Thank you," he said. He stood up. At the door he stopped and turned back. She was already drawing again. "Zaida." She looked up. "You are safe here." She nodded, unsurprised, as if this had already been decided by someone with more authority than him, and returned to her drawing. The 11th day brought the recording. It came from a woman Helena had found in the coastal city of Barron, a former nurse who had worked, briefly and terrified, in the facility Ambrose's paperwork had identified. The woman had kept a small camera in a book on a shelf for 9 years, waiting, she said, for someone to come who was not afraid. On the recording, in a room with white walls and no window, a younger Ife Adeyemi sat in a chair with her hands folded and spoke directly at the camera. She said her name, she said the date, she said the name of the facility, and then she said, in the calm voice of a doctor delivering a diagnosis, "If you are watching this, then someone very close to Silas Merrick does not want him to find me. Tell him the wound is in the house. Tell him to look at the hand that has held him longest." The recording ended. Silas watched it 3 times. On the 3rd viewing, he noticed, in the corner of the room behind her, a small silver object on a shelf. He froze the frame. It was a ring. It had been left there, perhaps, as a warning or as a signature. He turned to Helena. "How long do we have?" "Ambrose knows you know," she said. "He hasn't run because running would be a confession. But he has moved money. He is preparing something. My guess is a week." 6 days, Silas said. "How do you know?" "Because in 6 days it will be Zeta's birthday, and he will want it to happen then." Helena did not ask how he knew that either. The next 4 days moved like water under ice. Silas assembled evidence the way other men assemble armies. He pulled shipping manifests, tax filings, bank transfers, phone records. He pulled the original coroner's report on Odette and cross-referenced the timestamps against Ambrose's personal driver's log. He pulled, most damning of all, a chain of custody on the sedan she had been driving, and found that a maintenance appointment 3 days before her death had been performed by a mechanic who did not exist at a garage that had closed in the previous year. And through it all, he came home at 7 each night, sat across from Zeta at the kitchen table, ate whatever she had helped the housekeeper make, and did not speak of any of it. On the fifth night, he almost broke. He was standing at the sink washing a plate, a thing he had not done in 15 years, and Zeta came up beside him with a dish towel and began without a word to dry. Her small hands moved in a rhythm she must have learned from her mother. And Silas Merrick, the most feared name in the Eastern Harbor, put both his hands on the edge of the sink and lowered his head, and for the space of one breath, one single breath, he allowed himself to feel the full shape of what had been stolen from him. Then he lifted his head and dried the next plate, and did not let it happen again. On the morning of the sixth day, a package arrived at the front gate. It was addressed to Zaida. Inside was a small silver bracelet with a charm shaped like a seabird. There was no card. There did not need to be. Silas held the bracelet for a long time. Then he set it in a drawer and locked the drawer and went to see Ambrose Teller. Ambrose lived in a house of pale stone at the top of the western hill. He kept doves in a wooden coop behind the kitchen. He was that afternoon feeding them. He did not turn when Silas walked into the garden, and Silas did not announce himself. He simply stood at the edge of the flagstones and watched the older man's hand move, slow and deliberate, through the seed. "You brought her the bracelet," Silas said. "I brought her a welcome," Ambrose said. "She is family." "Yes," Silas said, "she is." Ambrose closed the coop. He turned. His face, at 71, was the face of a man who had been kind for so long that he had begun to believe it about himself. He did not look at Silas's hands. He looked at his eyes. "You have questions," he said. "I have answers," Silas said. "I came to see if you had any." Ambrose smiled. It was the smile of a man who had rehearsed this moment for 38 years. "Your father," he said, "killed my son. In the summer I turned 33. He did not know he had done it. He never knew. It was a shipment gone wrong on the South Pier, and my boy was 15 and had gone down to watch the boats, and a crate fell, and your father walked past the body 3 hours later and did not look at it because he did not know it was mine. I stood in the crowd. I saw him not look, and I decided that day that whatever your father built I would take from him piece by piece until nothing remained. Then he died before I could finish, and I turned the plan on you." He said this the way a man might read out a grocery list. "You loved me," Silas said. "I did," Ambrose said. "That was the price. I paid it. You killed Odette. I ended a chapter. You took Ife. I preserved her, for today, for this. You sent me the girl. I sent you the mirror, so that when I took her from you, you would understand what I lost." Silas took one step forward, only one. "Say the rest of it," he said. Ambrose's smile did not move. "The rest is that a man is not a man until he has watched his own child die. I have waited 38 years to make you a man, Silas. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, on the pier where your father did not look, you will become one." The doves shifted in their coop. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the quarter hour. Silas Merrick looked at the man who had held him on his knee the first Christmas after his mother's death, and he said very softly, "You mistook my grief for weakness. That is the only mistake you have ever made, and it will be enough." He turned. He walked out of the garden. He did not look back. He did not go to the pier the next day at 3 o'clock. He went at 2. He went alone, which was a lie. Renner and 11 others were on the rooftops, and Helena was in a courthouse across the city with a sealed envelope and a judge who owed her a favor from another life. But Ambrose saw only Silas walking down the length of the pier in a charcoal coat that was not buttoned, and the men Ambrose had brought, 9 of them, professionals from a warm-water republic, saw only Silas, and by the time they noticed the men on the roofs, it was already too late to draw a weapon that would matter. Ambrose stood at the end of the pier with a leather case at his feet. Behind him, tied to the piling, was a small boat. In the boat, blindfolded but breathing, sat Ife Adeyemi. Silas saw her and did not stop walking. He did not look at her. He looked at Ambrose. "Where is the girl?" Ambrose said. His voice, for the first time in Silas's memory, was not calm. "Somewhere you will never find her." "That was not the arrangement." "There is no arrangement. There is only a conversation. and you're about to have it with a woman named Helena Voss, and a courthouse full of very tired judges, and I'm going to spend the rest of my afternoon somewhere else." Silas reached into his coat. Ambrose flinched, actually flinched for the first time in 38 years, and Silas pulled out not a weapon but a folded piece of paper. He held it up. "The manifest," he said. "Both versions, your signature, the doctor's flight records, the garage that did not exist, Odette's autopsy, the recording from Barron, the bank in the Warmwater Republic, 41 death certificates, your driver's log, your dovekeeper's testimony, which I will admit surprised me, and a small silver bracelet with a charm shaped like a seabird, which you sent to a child at an address only 4 people in the world knew, one of whom is dead because of you, and one of whom is standing in a boat behind you. It is all in the sealed envelope in front of the judge. It has been for 11 minutes." Ambrose did not move. "You wanted to make me a man," Silas said. "You made me a father. That is a different thing. And a father does not need to kill you. A father needs you to be alive for a very long time in a very small room, so that every morning when you wake up, you will remember that the child you sent to destroy me is the reason you are still breathing." He folded the paper. He put it back in his coat. "Turn around," he said, "and look at the water. You did not look at my father's shipment. Look at this one." Ambrose turned. Silas walked past him to the boat, lifted the blindfold from Ife's eyes, and undid the ropes at her wrists. She did not speak. She looked at him. He looked at her. 9 years of silence passed between them in one breath, and then she raised her hand and slapped him across the face, hard. Once, and he took it without moving because he had known from the moment he saw the recording that she would need to give it to him and he would need to receive it. Then she stepped out of the boat, and he steadied her arm, and they walked together back down the pier past Ambrose Teller, who was still looking at the water, and Silas did not look at him either. It was the only mercy he allowed himself. The arrests began that afternoon. By nightfall, 7 counselors, 2 judges, a harbor commissioner, and a man who had once been photographed shaking hands with Silas's father were in custody. By the following week, the shipping consortium had been dismantled into 3 legal entities, 2 of which Silas would spend the next decade quietly emptying of everything they had ever done wrong. Helena handled the paperwork. She lost 8 pounds and gained a very good bottle of something that she opened, in her office, alone, on the evening the last document was signed. Ife stayed at the house on the coast for 3 weeks before she could bring herself to enter the room where her daughter slept. When she finally did, at 4 in the morning of the 22nd day, she found Zeta already awake, sitting up in the bed, waiting, as if she had known the hour. They did not speak that first night. They lay side by side on the small bed with their foreheads almost touching, and Ife wept without sound, and Zeta traced the shape of her mother's ear with one finger, as if confirming a fact she had not been willing to write down. Silas slept that same night for the first time in months. He slept for 11 hours. When he woke, the empty silver chain at his throat was still empty, but he did not, for a long moment, remember why he had kept it. Spring came. It did in Halden Bay eventually, always late, always in a hurry to leave. The cranes at the harbor kept moving because cities do not stop, but they moved for different reasons now, and the men who ran them answered to different names. Silas walked to the cemetery on the first warm afternoon of April. He went alone at first, up the bluff path, past the bell tower that had rung once and then never again, to the grave of the woman who had been his wife. He stood there for a long time. Odette had been, he understood now, both a stranger and a companion. A woman he had chosen for the wrong reasons and stayed with for the right ones. A woman who had loved him without ever fully knowing him, which was perhaps the only way anyone had ever loved him until now. He did not ask her forgiveness. He did not think she would have wanted it. He simply set down, on the flat stone at the head of her grave, a small object he had carried in his pocket for 3 months, the seabird pin. He left it there in the light. It caught the sun. Then he walked back down the path, and at the bottom where the gravel met the road, Ife and Zeta were waiting for him. Ife wore a coat too heavy for the weather because she was still cold from 9 years he could not undo. Zeta wore the yellow raincoat, which she now refused to grow out of, though her wrists had begun to show past the sleeves. She was carrying in both hands a paper cup of tea. She held it out to him. He took it. He blew on it before drinking the way she did, and she smiled the small, private smile of a child whose gesture has been received. They walked, not toward anything in particular, just along the road that ran above the harbor, with the water on one side and the low stone wall on the other. If did not take his hand. Not yet. He understood that too. But Zaida walked between them and reached up and took a hand from each, and swung a little, the way children swing when they are held by two people at once, and Silas Merrick, who had once been the most feared name in the Eastern Harbor, who had signed 142 orders that had ended lives, who had stood beside a coffin in the rain and not been able to cry, laughed. It was a small laugh, almost nothing. But I've heard it, and she turned her head and she looked at him for a long moment across the top of their daughter's soaked curls, and then she looked forward again and kept walking. At the bend in the road, Zeta stopped. She let go of Ife's hand and pulled at Silas's until he crouched down to her level. She studied his face the way she had studied it in the cemetery 4 months and a lifetime ago, and then she asked, very seriously, "Papa, are you still the scary one?" He thought about it. He owed her thought. "Only," he said, "to the people who would hurt us." She considered this. She seemed to find it acceptable. She took his hand again and pulled him upright and kept walking, and the three of them went on down the road above the water, and from a distance from the high paths where the bell tower stood silent, they were only 3 small figures, and no one who saw them would have guessed that one of them had been a king, and one of them had been a ghost, and one of them, the smallest, had done what no army in the country had managed to do. She had not defeated him. That was never the story. She had reached for his hand in a place where no one else would, and by doing so, she had reminded him that he had one. Everything else, the arrests, the trials, the empire cracking like ice in a warming sea, was only what happens when a man remembers he has a hand and decides at last what to hold with it. There is a version of this story in which Silas Merrick dies at the end. There is a version in which he becomes a saint. Neither version is true. He remained until the end of his days a difficult man with a difficult past, and there were nights when Ife would find him standing at the window of the coastal house looking at the water as though the water might give something back, and she would not disturb him, because some griefs are furniture, not weather. But there were also mornings, more of them than anyone who had known him at the funeral would have believed possible, when he would sit at the kitchen table and drink tea from a cup a small girl had poured, and he would look up at the two of them, the woman he had thought was gone and the child he had not known was coming. And he would understand, without needing to say it, that a man is not the sum of what he has done. A man is the sum of what he chooses next. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever carried a grief you did not know how to set down, or loved someone you were not brave enough to look for, or wondered whether a single small hand at the right moment could change the shape of a life, then do 3 things for me before you close this. Hit the like button so someone else in a hard hour finds this story tonight. Subscribe so we can walk into the next one together, and tell me in the comments, who was the person, small or grown, who reached for your hand when no one else would, and what did their courage cost them? I read every reply, and if there is someone in your life right now who needs to hear that a life can turn on a single held hand, share this with them before you sleep. Until the next story, stay soft in a world that keeps trying to make you hard, and stay kind in a world that has forgotten how.